Okay, Christopher, so you recommended this book, so that
I
means
did.
I'm going to hand over the podcast to you. I no longer have ownership over it.
No.
Big episode. This is my last episode. Yeah, can you just walk us through what we're talking about today?
Yeah, this was actually one of Jack's last work for Marvel back in the early 70s before he left for DC. And he was concurrently doing that book along with Jimmy Olsen. At least it was being published at the same time. And this is Jack's song at Marvel. He was pretty much frustrated with not having enough control over his books. He wanted to write his own. And in fact, in this case, this was the perfect opportunity for Jack because Stan said he was too busy to write this Inhuman story in Amazing Adventures. And so Jack, he's going to find another writer. Jack's like, no, I'll write it. I'll write it. So Jack actually writes the story, but Stan is credited as editor. And what I find interesting about that is his name is just as big as Jack's. If you were reading the book and didn't really know that Kirby was writing the stories, you would still think it was a Stan Lee and Jack Kirby book. It just says editor Stan Lee. And what's great about this series too is that Jack is paired with inker Chick Stone, who worked with Jack early on in his Marvel days, did some Fantastic Four with him, did some of the early Avengers, some of the early X-Men. So it's almost like he's come full circle before moving on. And it's only a 4-part story. It's only half the book. The other half is a Black Widow story. And this is a return to the split books that were very popular in the late 60s. And as Marvel became more successful and they were no longer in the control of DC's distribution system, they could then branch out with new titles. And so we turned to this split book because Martin Goodman figured, hey, if 2 out of 4 work, that's great. And if they all work, I'll just make more comics. So I did not read these at the time that they came out. I actually just read them fairly recently. I've always wanted to read them. This is one of those little gems to me at the end of the Silver Age, the beginning of the Bronze Age, where you still have Kirby on the book. And basically the premise is that Maximus wants control of the Great Refuge again. He wants to be king, and he also then wants to take over the world, of course, what a villain does not want to. And so he frames the Fantastic Four, make it look like they had shot missiles at the Inhumans' Great Refuge. Very clever device there where it says 4 on the missile fragment and made in USA. And they take the bait. And so there's a battle, goes over a couple of issues, and then, oh, well, we double checked and it really wasn't you. We wanted to verify and make sure. More about that later. And then the other 2 stories involve the Mandarin, one of my favorite characters as well. And there is so much that Jack packs into this book in its final few issues. The pacing varies per issue in terms of panels, but a lot of his signature techniques are found in this book. And we can talk about that. But that's the basic premise. This is, for now, in the 70s, his last Marvel book.
But last time we talked about Devil Dinosaur, that was his last big Marvel book before leaving again, going over to animation. So I like that we're going reverse and checking out his last Marvel book before he, leaves for DC. Mm-hmm.
I was curious also, did he write anything else for Marvel in this stint?
I don't think he did. I can't think of anything else that he actually wrote as credited as writer. Not then, not at that time in the Silver Age.
Yeah, so that seemed like a big, even if he wrote, some other stuff here, it seemed to me like a pretty big deal that this kind of the tail end of the Marvel Age, ushering in the 70s, and Jack wrote a book here.
Yeah, and Stan had a heavy hand in editing the book, and you can tell by the way the dialogue is. Yeah, and when I decided, or I suggested, actually, I didn't decide, I suggested that we look at this series, I did not know that I had this particular reference, the Jack Kirby Collector. It's the only issue that I have. I bought it years ago, And when I was doing my research, there's actually an article about this very series that Jack wrote. And I was like, oh, how convenient. The final family reunion.
Yeah.
And the writer of this article, Mark Learer, talks about Stan's sound editorial presence. And if I may quote, he says, the first most obvious thing one notices upon reading the 10-page Inhuman stories in Amazing Adventures 1 through 4 is that the deficiencies, I think he meant to say deficiencies, that mar Kirby as a script in his later self-edited books are practically nowhere to be found. One would never know from reading these stories that Jack Kirby was a flawed scripter, as his later books revealed him to be. There are far fewer instances of emphasis on the wrong words. Dialogue is understandable on the first reading. The conversations between characters clarify for the reader whatever may not be evident in the pictures alone without sounding forced or contrived. The awkwardness is absent. And I noticed that too. It definitely has Stan's hand in it. But you can see how great, again, a storyteller Jack is. And he fits a lot into those pages. And I noticed the first couple of books, there were more panels. And then the third issue, things start to expand and open up a little bit. We have larger panels. And I think maybe by the fourth final chapter, he's like, okay, got to wrap this up. I'm out of here. So again, we go back to the more, packing more into those 10 pages.
I was reading this through the hardcover edition. This collects the back of Thor stories that tell of the Inhumans, as well as the 4 Amazing Adventures issues. And there's a great essay in it by Mark Evanier, who kind of talks about the history of the Inhumans and getting into this little pocket of stories getting produced. And he says that way back in 1965, Wally Wood came into the Marvel Studios and said, oh, hey, I heard that Harvey is looking to expand their lineup. So they approached me to see if I could create some stories for them. And this put Stan and Goodman, the owner of the company, into a panic, because they had been in these shackles by DC, who had been publishing their books and had limited the number of books they were allowed to publish for all these years. Hence the 2 characters, 2 stories in multiple books that you mentioned earlier. They thought the only way we can fight this, because Harvey is a strong company, and Harvey's planning to get into superheroes. They were, big with Richie Rich and Casper the Friendly Ghost, and so they were concerned that this could put them out of business if they got into the superhero game and were creating as many stories as they could, and they had the money and power as a company in the industry to be able to do this. And so Stan went to Kirby and said, we got to create as many characters as we can. And for a week, they started generating all these ideas. And then meanwhile, Goodman went to the printer saying, you've got to let us publish more books or we're out of business. And so there was this fury of creativity and this desperation. And it's hazy. They don't know for sure everything that went down, but it looks like a Wyatt Wingfoot type prototype was created. It looks like a Black Panther prototype was created. It looks like Black Bolt was created to be a standalone character. You see the results of this, because there's about a 10-month period of Fantastic Four where, back to back, you've got Black Panther, Silver Surfer, Galactus, the Inhumans. It's one of the most amazing little chunks of Fantastic Four production. So it turns out that they were not allowed to produce additional books, and it turns out Harvey did not wind up going down this path, and everything just wound up staying as it was, except that now Stan and Jack had this enormous creation of new ideas. And so that's why they seeped into the Fantastic Four and other books. You know, they had to use these in some way. And so now we get to years later, they are suddenly able to produce as many books as they want. They, instead of having Iron Man and Captain America in the same book, they both get their own books and so on. And so they thought, well, the Inhumans were popular. Let's try something with that. So there was a Marvel superheroes series that there was kind of little tryout concepts, and they did sort of a prototype of the Inhumans with a Medusa standalone that was drawn by Gene Colan, and it kind of got scrapped. And you know, so it was kind of a slow build at that point to this idea. Okay, let's try and get an Inhumans book. And Jack, why don't you just take charge, because we have more books now. So Stan just physically isn't capable to write everything. And that brings us to this series, I think.
You mentioned how they were playing with all of these ideas and each issue moved so quickly. That's the entire Fantastic Four series. Whereas issue 1, you know, introduces the the new Marvel Age of Comics. It was like the first new Marvel, like when Marvel Comics happened. You know, in World War II, there was Marvel Mystery Comics, that was like Submariner and the Human Torch and Angel, who no one remembers. And every issue just seemed to be building onto this mythology that's still used today. Like issue 2 was the Skrulls, and then you fast forward and you can tell that they were moving so quickly, sometimes they didn't even know what was coming. You know, issue 36 introduces Medusa with the Frightful Four, this, you know, bizarro version of the Fantastic Four with Sandman, Paste Pot Pete, the Wizard. Medusa shows up, and
all those villains except Medusa had appeared before, right?
Right,
so,
in
so
the Human Torch comic, I believe there was wasn't Ian Strange Tales?
That sounds
yes.
right.
And yeah,
Paste
Sandman
Pot
is, you know, Spider-Man. They're moving so quickly, and there's no mention of the Inhumans, and it's not even until issue 44 and 45 where you start seeing them. Like they introduce Gorgon, and then 45 is when the Inhumans show up and you get Joe Sinnott. He's starting to become the main inker at this point.
That Medusa as an Inhuman, I always found odd, you know, because this is a group of villains, and as the story evolves, she's just kind of not a villain anymore, and you never really understand, well, why was she a villain? They try to explain, you know, how
it's not even that. They never address it. It's they have the Great Refuge, which is kind of their little hideout, and they follow them down there, and it's like, wait, Medusa, weren't you part of that? And she was like, no, I'm here now. I'm here now because the plot demands it.
Reminds me of professional wrestling, where you've got this bad guy wrestler, and then they realize, oh, that wrestler's popular, and so there's this sudden switch, and all of a sudden the bad wrestler's a good wrestler, and now everybody's cheering for the wrestler that everyone was booing for a few months earlier.
You know, the Humans never really took off as a standalone book, and I don't know why that is. Even the Marvel TV series or the special didn't do very well. And it just seems to be so many great characters in that group. I don't know what it is. I don't know if there's no way to connect with them like you could with the Fantastic Four, with the family infighting, and maybe that they're just too distant. I don't know, but it just never really was successful as a standalone series. You don't see it now as a standalone series. Every once in a while it pops up, and they try, but it never seems to
botch it in recent years. Like they don't even have Black Bolt in the royal family anymore. It's just like, here's some generic dude who can burst into flame, and it's like, we already have one of those guys. I see some parallels with the Eternals, you know, since we talked about that in an earlier podcast, where it's the Eternals are kind of like a royal family that are just hidden off and trying to live their own lives. But I don't know what about, because whenever they show up, Inhumans or Eternals, they show up, they're treated as like some kind of body horror. You have the Avengers who are accepted, and then Inhumans and X-Men are like, no, freaks, get away from me. When they show up in these Kirby books, do you guys resonate with them? Do you enjoy seeing them? We've talked about in other books, Machine Man and stuff, where it's like they fit better as their own story as opposed to just being shelled out as IP.
I like them in the Fantastic Four and in this story, especially just because maybe because Jack's hands are on it, but it's his art, and he makes Black Bolt very powerful and regal looking. And if Kirby touches it, I enjoy the Inhumans more.
There was some gorgeous artwork, some just lovely layouts. How he told two stories, right? He's got the story of them being framed, or rather the Fantastic Four being framed. And this is the story that Marvel used on the covers of so many books, the two superheroes fist fighting against each other because there's a misunderstanding. So, Act 1, they explain the misunderstanding. Act 2, the heroes have to fight because they both think the other's the bad guy. And end of Act 2, they realize, oh, it was a misunderstanding. We've been duped, and here's the real villain. And now we can both go after the real villain. So many stories, Hulk versus this, Spider-Man versus this, the Avengers. You can picture all these famous covers of hero versus hero. And so story 1, the issues 1 and 2, that's our story again. Inhumans versus Fantastic Four. It's a misunderstanding. Story 2, we've got the Mandarin, and it plays into that we must hide from humans because we're this special race, and so we want to keep our distance. And how do we keep that secret? But Mandarin has discovered them, and he's discovered he can capture this power that'll make him the ultimate villain. Another story that we've seen over and over in the comics. And I wanted to mention, before this came out and the Inhumans, they didn't know what to do with them. So there are little 4 or 5 page stories in the backs of Thor that talk about the origin of the Inhumans. And this links them, you mentioned the Skrulls earlier, this links them to the Kree, who came to Earth back in prehistoric times and said, let's give these humans a chance to really become ultimate beings. And so with Kree experiments on this small pocket of the primitives, those primitives became this advanced, amazing race who was feared by the primitives. So they had to distance themselves to live in their little paradise. And that is another theme that you kind of see popping up in Kirby's sort of mythic thinking.
They build on that it's actually a 1-page flashback sequence. I don't know if you can see it, but in issue 46, they do this 4-panel sequence, and there's no mention of the Kree because the Kree don't exist yet. And then later on, they start introducing like Ronan the Accuser and the Supreme Intelligence. So Kirby's starting to get really weird with it at this point. It's not the Red Scare anymore. We have to do something that's like this like green brain with tentacles coming out of it. And by this point, it's the end of the Fantastic Four series, or Jack's time on the Fantastic Four. Sue Storm had a child recently. Franklin Richards was born in the pages of the Jack and Stan run. She's no longer she's not an active member right now. So when you pick up that first Amazing Adventures series, Crystal is like part of the team.
Right.
So for a while, Crystal was a character where she was just a love interest for Johnny Storm. Didn't know what to do with her at all.
She wasn't Inhuman, though.
Yes.
You've got to keep in mind, she's part of this pocket who came out of the we must be secret because of love, right, drawing her into,
which I love, because her first appearance
world.
is she's just walking around in the street, and Johnny sees her. She's like, hey, what's she doing over there? Then this big dog shows up and they run away. They didn't know what to do with her for a while because Johnny was like, you can't be an Inhuman. And then later on, they decide, okay, she has elemental powers because we know what we're going to do with her. Let's put her on the team. You don't need to read the Fantastic Four to understand who the Fantastic Four are in this series, or why Crystal's there, or why they're fighting the Fantastic Four. It just kind of, if you read those stories, it respects what came before, and Jack really just gets to do what he wants with it. I think over the course of these 4 Amazing Adventures issues, it's really concise. You know, it's just like 2 issues of story, and he doesn't really waste time with anything. It's like, okay, Fantastic Four, and then Mandarin, and then let's go over to DC and do all of that over there.
Now that said about wasting time, there's some interesting use of panels, because when I picture Kirby and pacing, you know, you'll have a panel and it'll be so packed with information that, you know, normally you might see that much information playing out over a page. And with pacing, he did slow some stuff down in great ways. You've got the Mandarin wrestling with Triton. You've got the flip view of Triton kind of pushing him down, turning his fist to ice. You see the ice getting worse. This is 4 panels of basically, you know, an arm wrestling scene, right? And that seems, you know, uncommon for Kirby pacing to me, as opposed to, you know, showing one picture and Stanley's dialogue explains to us that, you know, oh, the car drove up and these people jumped out and the crowd ran up and the people got out of the car, and that's all in one panel. And here we just have, you know, arm wrestling for 4 panels.
They do that in issue 3, where, you know, the Mandarin's watching the Inhumans. It's right before that fight that you showed, and they just mention everyone's powers. Triton is a guy who stomps. Karnak is a guy who knows weaknesses, and Black Bolt has this tuning fork on his head. And it feels like that. This gets credited to Stan Lee a lot. The whole every comic is someone's first comic, but it's one of those things that they don't really. It doesn't happen in the 4th one, and I don't remember them mentioning it in 1 or 2. So it was weirdly placed, where maybe they were thinking, okay, maybe someone jumped on with issue 3 and we're going to describe everything as it happens.
There were other sequences like that, I thought, where, oh, this is interesting how he's spacing it out. As I'm flipping for it, I just want to say, you know, Kirby's hand anatomy is something to behold, and to just call attention to it in a splash page like that, with each Inhuman represented by 1 ring. That's lovely Kirby work.
That
that's one of my
the
favorite
first
pages.
issue too. Yeah, where it just shows everyone's faces.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is another kind of interesting play out where you see everyone. You see 2 Inhumans behind him, and then you see different Inhumans behind him, and then he just repeated that one. And I
love
thought
that. The eyes, though, that's my favorite part of that sequence, where
comes in, he zooms in a little closer, you know.
But I mean, he switches out Gorgon with Medusa. Well, actually, he switches out Karnak as well.
Yeah, you've got the switch out here, and then they remain here, and then they're kind of all mixed in. So, you know, you're panned back, you come in, you pan back even farther.
Black Bolt has some great close-ups, and I didn't mean to cut you off. In issue 1, there's that moment where he's fighting the missile, and he has a 1970s Jack Kirby close-up on his eyes. Yeah, there are a lot of great sequences in there where it's kind of the build-up to what Jack will do in the 70s. So it's cool to see him kind of test the waters there, and then you get to see him go full-on, you know, blocky Kirby.
It's a real transition for him too, because speaking of eyes, and some of the panels when the Mandarin's explaining what he was trying to do, I like the head in the panel, just the talking head, and then just the eyes in some of the panels. And that kind of reminds me of some of the earlier books that Jack had done. And I think it might have been Loki or somebody, where you just see the eyes. And that's kind of going back to the way he used to do the book. So you kind of see this transition to what his books look like in the 70s and what he was doing back at the beginning of Marvel.
Yeah,
And that's why
I pictured the Atlas giant
Mhm.
monster stories. Those would often pan in on the eyes, pan back so far you see the planet Earth and the other stars.
Yeah, I think it's like a perfect encapsulation of his work at that time, and before he moved on to DC. But
Good.
I really enjoyed the series. It was tight. It was well paced, and it's some of his. I think some of his best work, and definitely withstands speaking of the scripting. It reads very well without snappy banter. It's a little more serious actually, which is how Jack did a lot of his books. In fact, he even makes mention of the great atomic threat. You know, how, you know, what will mankind go and verify who's the cause of something before pushing the button? So he even works in a very serious topic that relates to their own dispute with Maximus trying to take over, which I like how Black Bolt knew that it wasn't really the Fantastic Four. So he sent Triton to go check it out. He had a suspicion, but yet let's fight first. Otherwise, there's no book. It's a 3-part story.
Well, you don't want to waste time. So if you start fighting now, then if you're wrong, you can just stop fighting.
Yeah,
But if you're right, then you got that fighting started. I love Chick Stone as an inker over Kirby. I always going through whatever X-Men or I'm always delighted when I see his work. He's got a real thick line, which I think it gives it sort of an interesting cartoony feel, but I just love the feel of it. I wanted to address your question about why do you think this series never made it real well on its own. I thought that would be a good opportunity to just talk about these characters a little and who they are and what their powers are. And I don't know if that has something to do with it, but they are kind of a strange set of powers in these characters, considering they're these genetically modified creatures that are supposed to be the ultimate creature. They're kind of strange powers, I think, too. And of course the costumes are a little strange too. And I don't know if people don't relate to that, maybe.
Gene Simmons did. Gene Simmons related to Black Bolt quite a bit.
Black Bolt, who can speak, but if he speaks, his voice is so powerful, it's like a bomb going off, right? Or a missile or whatever. So he can't ever speak in practical terms. He can also fly, though. Medusa has long hair that she can control like a limb or multiple limbs. You've got Gorgon, who's one or maybe both feet are so powerful he can stomp earthquakes, basically, and he can control the path of those earthquake stomps. I don't know how powerful his arms are. Like, could he punch you really powerfully? I think it's all about the stomp, right? Triton can breathe in water, so that kind of keeps him out of most every situation.
Great design, though.
Right.
Just purple
Yeah.
and green meshes really well.
Yeah, great design. You've got Karnak, who is a master of a specific kind of karate, where I guess before the karate is the brilliant mind that can analyze weakness points and then use his karate. Even though he's basically a tiny pipsqueak looking guy with a giant head, he can use his karate to pinpoint that exact weakness spot that can cause buildings to crumble down, or if you're trapped in a cave, he can find that perfect spot that destroys all the boulders to clear the way. These are very weirdly specific powers, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I learned so much about Black Bolt's tuning fork. I didn't know it could do all those things, including fix Ben's robe.
Yeah, what was that about?
But the powers just kept changing throughout the series. I was like, wow, he's shooting out electrons, he's shooting out other kinds of powers. It was multi-purpose. It was like the Swiss Army knife on his head. It was great.
It's funny you mentioned that, because in the origin story of Black Bolt in the Thor, he's a baby, and they're talking about, oh, look how he has this power and this power and this power, but when he gets older he'll lose those powers, but he has this power and this, and so like it was like built into his origin that he's got all these bizarre powers, and that they do kind of come and go, which again reminds me of professional wrestling, this idea of, oh, we'll take this idea in our wrestling stories and we'll just throw as many ideas out as we can, and if they don't stick, we'll move on from those and pretend they didn't exist. It's that storytelling. Just put it all out, and we'll see what speaks to the fans.
There was another character that kind of was a precursor to Jack's time at DC, and it's the Mandarin's assistant. I call him Bootleg Desaad, but he even shares the same fate as Desaad from New Gods, where Darkseid just gets fed up with him and vaporizes him. I don't know. I like that they picked the Mandarin. I like that they didn't go with Doctor Doom. They could have easily gone with any of those bigger characters. I love the rings on the Mandarin. You know, usually artists will draw him just shooting beams out of there, but I love that Jack did that fist fight that you were talking about, Chris, where he has him freezing his arms. If this was a more violent book, the Mandarin would have, you know, ripped off Triton's arms and just beaten him to death with that.
I think Kirby did such a great use of the rings. You know, you see over and over these amazing images of the fingers and the rings, and once again, you know, this in other Stan Lee Kirby books might have been one panel. He takes 3 panels to show him sinking into the quicksand or whatever it is here, and there are multiple just fantastic images of that face of the Mandarin. On the one side, I wonder, you know, how did they choose Mandarin? But on the other, when you see how he used the Mandarin as such a visually strong part of this story, I can see him saying, you know, I can make use of this in interesting visual ways, and it makes total sense.
Is there anything you guys think we missed, or anything you want to throw out there?
I thoroughly enjoyed this basically 2-issue Kirby, you know, quick hit it and goodbye to Marvel.